We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's the beginning of the Constitution of the United States. And this video is about the U.S. Constitution, the founding document of the United States of America. In order to create this video, I hung an American flag behind me because I thought that was appropriate. I couldn't find my MAGA hat, unfortunately. Founding document of the United States is super important for environmental policy, even though we don't really think of it as such. The Constitution was written in a pre-ecological era when people didn't really think about environmental conservation or environmental rights or people's right to a healthy and clean environment or clean air and clean water and biodiversity. But the Constitution does contain components that speak to the need for environmental policy, and it does contain components that give the nation the right to create environmental policy. And so those are the components that we will focus on. So, like all founding documents, the Constitution of the United States creates the abstract concept of a country or of the United States of America and brings that abstract concept into being through the words on the page that give life to our government and give us the rights of citizenship, and we all then participate in a social contract about citizenship that includes things like following laws and paying taxes, and that we will adhere to those laws and do all of the things that it means to be an American. There are two main parts of the Constitution that I want you to know about. The first are the articles of the Constitution themselves. These were written at the time that the Constitution was written, and they create our system of governance. They create the presidency, the executive branch. They create the cabinet and give the president the right to create different agencies and departments of the federal government and to appoint the officials of those agencies. The Constitution creates the legislative branch of our government, the House of Representatives and the Congress, and discusses the number of representatives and senators that will be in each house of the government. It creates the judicial system, the federal and Supreme Court system, and it gives the Senate and the House the ability to create laws and collect taxes. And then there's also the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights are the amendments to the Constitution. Some of the Bill of Rights were written at the time the Constitution was written or shortly thereafter, and other amendments have been added to the Constitution throughout the history of our nation. And so we're going to focus on the specific articles and the specific bills of rights or amendments that speak to environmental policy. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution begins, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives." And it then goes on to discuss the makeup of the House and the Senate, the number of representatives and the number of senators and how they will be elected and their term limits. And it enables the government to make laws and regulations, including those that protect the environment, such as the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act or the Endangered Species Act. Article 1, Section 7 and 8 enables the federal government to levy taxes, such as permit fees. Those are permits for the different emissions that industries might put into air and water. An example would be the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which is the pollutant elimination system of the Clean Water Act, or the nitrous oxide cap and trade program under the Clean Air Act, which has permits associated with it, and those permits have fees behind them. It's the Constitution that gives our House and our Senate the right to create laws that include those taxes or those fees.
I snagged this slide about the Environmental Protection Agency's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit requirement from an EPA workshop. NPDES permits are required of anybody discharging pollutants into waters of the United States. We call this a pay-to-pollute plan. Anybody who needs a permit must pay the federal government, and they then give you the permit to discharge those pollutants, and they put parameters on the amount of pollutants that you can discharge. But you have to pay a fee in order to receive that permit.
Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution includes the Commerce Clause. That clause reads that the Congress shall have the right to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. That means that Congress can regulate activities that affect commerce, including the productions and processes that create byproducts of industry. So those are the emissions that go into air and water and cross state boundaries or cross international boundaries. So something like air emissions that are produced from coal-fired power plants in the Midwest that then blow across the United States and create the acid rain that we experience in the Adirondacks. The Commerce Clause gives the federal government to regulate those emissions, so to create the Cross-State Air Pollution Reduction Program. The acronym is CASPR for that. And it also gives the federal courts the right to hear and try cases that relate to cross-state interactions, including pollution.
The impacts of many industrial air pollutants are not felt at the site where those pollutants are created. Instead, they drift across the country and their impacts are felt many states away. The cross-state air pollution rule is a rule created by the Environmental Protection Agency under the Clean Air Act, and it regulates some of these pollutants. It's the Commerce Clause of the Constitution that allows EPA to regulate cross-state air pollutants.
Article 2 of the Constitution enumerates the rights and responsibilities of the executive branch. That's the president and the cabinet. One of the important things that it does is it gives the president the right to create treaties with foreign countries. That also includes things like the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species and the Migratory Bird Act or the Paris Agreement about carbon emissions and carbon reduction relative to climate change. Trump has withdrawn us from that treaty, but it's that section, Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, that gives the president the right to create, or in this case, withdraw from those international treaties. That same Commerce Clause gives the right to the federal government to create laws that regulate commerce between the United States and other countries. That includes something like the Migratory Bird Act, which regulates and protects migratory birds that spend their summers in the United States of America and then winter in South America and Central America and Hispaniola and other places, or that travel through the United States, or something like the Convention for the International Trade of Endangered Species, which regulates commerce related to rare and threatened species around the world. That might be bought and sold in the United States, or that might be listed as endangered species in the United States but are bought and sold somewhere else. The United States has the ability to create laws that influence the way those species are protected here. We can't actually regulate the species when they are in other countries, but we can regulate commerce related to those species if they're coming into the United States. Article 3 of the Constitution outlines the responsibilities of the judicial branch of government, including the responsibility of the federal courts, the Supreme Court, to hear cases about constitutional conflict, including cases relative to the environment. And so that's an important one because that's where the federal government's enforcement capabilities come from. Finally, Article 4 of the Constitution in Section 3 is what we call the Property Clause. And it's this clause that gives the federal government the right to own and be responsible for federal public lands. Without this section, the federal government wouldn't be able to create things like the national park system or wilderness areas under the United States Wilderness Act. So it's Article 4, Section 3 provides the federal government with the right to create laws regulating federal lands like national parks, Forest Service land, federal range lands owned by the Bureau of Land Management, and to regulate those, including for the purpose of conservation and creation of wilderness and wildlife refuges.
This map is created by USGS. It shows protected areas in the United States. It shows federally protected land, state lands, and privately protected lands. There are some things I want you to notice. First, that about 30% of the country is protected in some way. That's an enormous percentage of our country. 2, I want you to notice that most federally protected lands occur in the western United States. And 3, I want you to notice the Adirondacks, the purple space up in the northeast, as one of the largest protected areas in the country.
Then we get to the Bill of Rights, which are amendments to the Constitution. The first 10 amendments were written at the time of the Constitution by the framers of the Constitution. The others were added later. The First Amendment, as we all know, is the amendment that gives us the right to freedom of religion and freedom of speech and the freedom to assemble. And that includes our freedom to criticize the United States federal government and to protest. So if we think about that, the importance of that amendment for environmental policy, it's the amendment that gives us the right to hold protests and demonstrations and advocate on behalf of the environment. That includes things like the climate marches, the People's Climate March. It includes things like their right for Black Lives Matter to congregate and assemble and protest the federal government.
It's the First Amendment that gives us our freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly. That includes the right to assemble and advocate on behalf of the environment.
The Second Amendment to the Constitution, or the second item in the Bill of Rights, reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." So that's the right to bear arms, the right to own guns. As it relates to environmental policy, it includes the right to own guns for hunting and for defense. But I think probably for hunting is the strongest connection that we have to environmental policy from the Second Amendment.
The Second Amendment gives us our right to bear arms and to form militias. This amendment came into direct conflict with the federal government's right to protect federal lands, property, and buildings in 2016 when an Oregon militia took over a National Wildlife Refuge and National Wildlife Refuge Station to protest what they saw as overreach and overregulation by the federal government on public lands.
The Fourth Amendment of the United States establishes private property law, the right of the people to secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That establishes your right to private property and to own property. And as it relates to the environment, that means that you have the right to determine how your property is used and to create something called a conservation easement, which is a property restriction for the purpose of environmental land conservation. Private property is one of the strongest methods of land conservation that we have in the United States. And we have, I would say, a norm in the United States of thinking that private property is the strongest method we have for protecting property from development. And so things like conservation easements and land trusts are designed to use private property law as conservation tools, and they're extremely important tools for conservation.
The Fourth Amendment protects your right to private property. Private land conservation is one of the strongest conservation approaches that we have in the United States. This table illustrates the acreage and percentage of conservation land in public ownership and private ownership in the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
And the 10th Amendment reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." That means that for any purpose that the federal government hasn't already established a law or regulation, the states may establish their own laws or regulations. Those laws and regulations can't supersede laws of the federal government, but if there's space that the federal government hasn't regulated, a state may step in and determine to regulate that on its own. So states can create their own rules for something like carbon emissions or energy conservation, where the federal government hasn't stepped in. And we actually see that happening. The federal government has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement and has not acted to establish national laws about carbon emissions, and so several states have already done that. At this moment, we actually see some states doing that in such a strong way that our federal government is challenging them in court as being too far, but it's Amendment 10 that gives the states the right to do that. So as you can see, it's the founding documents of the United States, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that give the federal government its ability to exist, first of all, but then also the ability to manage and regulate and take care of the environment. It speaks specifically to commerce and specifically to land. It doesn't speak specifically to air or water or energy or biodiversity, but in its broad powers, the broad powers that it allocates to the federal government to create regulations and to create permit fees and taxes, the federal government has assumed the right to regulate air, land, and water, and biodiversity, something like the Endangered Species Act. We've got other policies that are about biodiversity as well. But as you can see, it's the documents themselves, these founding documents, that enable our federal government to do those things. So something that I do want to make clear at the end of this video is that while talking about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and sitting in front of an American flag, it's easy to feel like I am trying to suggest that the United States is great and effective at creating environmental policy and managing the environment. And that's not what I'm saying at all. I don't want to give the impression that I'm providing any kind of judgment on our effectiveness at environmental policy. And so I hope I haven't done that. I want you to know that I'm trying to remain neutral. But I do want you to come away with an appreciation for our founding documents and the way that they give the government the right to regulate and manage and take care of the environment. You don't necessarily need to believe that they do a great job, but just appreciate that it's these founding documents that give the ability for that to happen, and that when they were written in the 1780s, that our the founders of the country had the foresight to set up the nation in the way that they did. So I think that is pretty cool, and that we should have an appreciation for that. All right, thanks a lot.